In 1991, Microprose released Sid Meier's Civilization. Civilization was the first in a series of extremely popular strategy games that have been released every 5 or 6 years ever since the first game. Civilization is sort of the classic example of a 4X strategy game. The 4 X's being explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. In the game and its sequels, the player is tasked with guiding a civilization from prehistorical, pre-technological times all the way up through the present day and into the future. The Civilization series has been extremely successful. It's an iconic PC gaming franchise. And through Civilization, we can track a lot of the interesting developments in game design, graphic technology, and also in music. You can see, for example, that the first Civilization game graphically is very simple. It's a flat 2D representation of a map. You can see that the game can be played without a mouse, or with less mouse input. If you look at the bold letters on game, orders, advisors, you're seeing keyboard shortcuts that open these menus. So this game, Civilization 1 in 1991, was released for the Amiga, for early IBM PCs, a lot of times operating pre-Windows using the DOS operating system. As things progress, you can see the graphics get more and more sophisticated. Here in Civilization 2 and 3, we've got a sort of isometric view, still clearly two-dimensional in the case of Civilization 2, but you've got some simple 3D graphics going on in Civ 3. And then as we move on to the more recent games, we're getting more and more sophisticated 3D renderings that let you see the map from all angles, all levels of detail. And the graphics get better and better from there. We also can hear the music getting better. The Civilization series, from the beginning, has used existing music, classical music, and folk music and other traditional pieces of music to represent its civilizations. Alongside these recognizable tunes, composers such as Jeff Briggs in the first game have also written original pieces of music, and these pieces of music get recycled and reused throughout the series as well. So just as we had read in Will Gibbons' article Blip Bloop Bach, game designers of the past have frequently used existing classical or folk music to sort of imply a given time or place. So you see in the left-hand column, to represent the German civilization, they use classical music by Bach and Mozart. They use a strange minor key version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic to represent the Americans. And they use La Marseillaise, the French national anthem, to represent Napoleon and the French. Right-hand side, we see that they've also written a lot of new original pieces of music. So the Civilization games also give us a really good rundown of the history of game audio. If you look to the first game, Civilization in 1991, uses a technology called MIDI, which stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. So MIDI is a system of encoding so that each individual note has a pitch value. Every note on the keyboard is given a number. so that you can have the pitch value, you can have how long the note is supposed to last, you can encode information such as how loud it's supposed to be, if it's supposed to start quiet and get louder, start loud and get softer, things like that. And the advantage of MIDI is, number one, it's very standardized. It's still in use today in programs like GarageBand, in music notation software. It's a way of encoding music in a standardized way that goes between computer systems and different operating systems, different programs, and it can always be read and rendered by almost any kind of computer music system. One of the unique things about MIDI, especially in the early days, though, is that the sound would actually vary a lot. The particular sound of MIDI instruments varied based on the type of computer you had and the type of sound hardware you had. So a MIDI soundtrack would sound different on every computer and would also kind of tend to sound artificial, particularly in the 1990s. Another advantage of MIDI is that it's actually comparatively very, very small. Since you're encoding music as data for the computer to reconstruct rather than recording an actual high-fidelity recording, it's ideal for distributing games on floppy disks, which only had a capacity of 1.44 megabytes each. It's very, very tiny by today's standards. MIDI was a good way to encode your music in there and then have the computer realize it, which used a comparatively small amount of storage. So if your game was shipping on only 1 or 2 or 3 floppy disks, MIDI was the perfect solution. So let's listen to a little bit from Civilization 1. We heard a couple of the pre-existing tunes. Now, for one last example of MIDI, let's listen to one of the originals. Moving on in the series, Civilization 2 had slightly more sophisticated audio. Coming out in the mid-90s, 1996, Civ 2 is a really good example of Red Book audio. And this was a format that was very popular for games in the mid-1990s. And Red Book is basically CD audio format. You would get a game disc, like the one shown here. The first track would be the game data. Then from tracks 2 and onward, you would have regular music tracks just like you'd get in a CD album. So you actually could take this game disc, put it into your regular CD player. Track 1 would give you silence or sometimes static, depending on the kind of CD player you had. But other tracks could simply be played on your CD player like normal. So you actually could listen to the soundtrack of a game outside of the game. So CD audio allows game developers to actually pre-record the music and play it back on a CD. So it ends up being the same for everyone. It ends up, it allows you to use very high fidelity recordings. People would use symphony orchestras. Things like the Descent 2 had an actual heavy metal band record instrumental music for it. So the CD opened up high fidelity audio. And often in these games, you would actually hear a sort of pause. Your CD drive would whir as it was loading the next track. It actually had to switch tracks just like a CD player did. Civilization 2 is a slightly interesting case because what you'll hear in just a moment is even though they used Red Book audio, they could reproduce their recordings exactly. Because of production constraints, they actually were still using synthesizers. So you'll hear that the classical music being used in Civilization 2 is actually still just played by synthesizers, but it was actually performed and recorded and burned onto a CD and thus loaded as audio files rather than as MIDI information. So this is Ode to Joy, the famous tune from the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, as heard in Civilization 2. Finally, in later games, you would start to see digital audio. Songs recorded in digital formats such as WAV format, MP3 format, these could be placed on a CD or a game DVD, or they can simply be used with a digital download game. The songs, the music, simply becomes part of the game data. So digital audio formats are not playable on your CD. If you have a CD-ROM that has one, it's only going to have one track of data on it. But these are very flexible, can be compressed, can exceed the limits of CD audio, since if you're working with CD audio, you have the data taking away some of the format, and then you're limited to the 70 minutes of music that you can actually burn onto a CD. So using WAV format opens things up to more than 70 minutes of music, and it gets around sort of the loading times or the very analog nature of having to start a track and then stop while you shift to another one, which would give you pauses in the music. Digital music can be used seamlessly, and it's the standard that we start to see from the late 90s through today. So here's an example of the full orchestral recordings that you would hear in Civilization 4. This is from one of Bach's Brandenburg concertos, and you hear it during the Renaissance portion of the game. The combination of using digital audio and the greater memory and storage capacities of more modern computers means actually that the later Civilization games have much longer and more extensive soundtracks. So here's an example of a piece by John Adams, which you hear during the modern period. Finally, I'd like to draw attention to a famous piece of music from Civilization 4. Civ 4 is the subject of our big reading for this unit, Karen Cook's essay on the use of existing music to represent historical progress, to represent the different musical cultures in the game. But it's also notable that Civ 4 includes original music, including this very well-known title screen piece of music. Baba Yetu was composed by Christopher Tin for Civ 4. And as you can see here, the text of it is actually the Lord's Prayer in Swahili. So, sort of an interesting story for this piece of music. The game came out in 2005 with this piece of music. When Christopher Tin released a solo album of his own compositions a couple of years later, he actually won a Grammy. So this is an instance of a piece of video game music actually winning a Grammy Award, even though it came a couple of years after the fact and in a slightly different context. So let's finish up this video by listening to Baba Yetu, the introductory music to Civilization 4.
Baba yetu amina, Baba yetu